Your last Sunday of comfort is already over. Enjoy the coffee. Enjoy the quiet. It won't last. I watched my wife set 2 mugs on the kitchen counter at 7,014 in the morning, the way she always did. One for her, one for me. And I thought about how a small, ordinary gesture could survive the complete destruction of everything it once meant. She hummed something I didn't recognize while she waited for the machine to finish. Outside, the sprinklers kicked on across the lawn. The neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. A perfectly normal Saturday in Crestwood, Ohio. Population 31,000, where nothing interesting ever happened to anyone, except that 3 weeks earlier, I had found a second phone tucked inside the inner pocket of my wife's gym bag, and the last number in the call log belonged to my best friend. I didn't say anything that morning. I set the phone back exactly where I found it, zipped the bag closed, and went upstairs to shower. Under the hot water, I stood completely still for a long time, my hands flat against the tile, and waited for them to start shaking. They never did. That was the first sign that I was already becoming someone different. My name is Daniel, and for 17 years I believed I had built something solid. I was a structural engineer. I designed load-bearing systems for a living, calculated the exact weight a thing could carry before it failed. There was a dark irony in that I had never once thought to apply those principles to my own marriage. I had assumed it was unbreakable. I had assumed wrong. My wife and I had met in our late 20s at a company barbecue. She worked in marketing, I worked in design, and we had spent 3 hours at the same picnic table talking about nothing important. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony at her parents' lake house in Michigan. My best friend stood beside me at the altar. He had been my college roommate, my hiking partner, the man I called at 2 a.m. when my father died. He gave a toast at the reception that made half the room cry. He talked about loyalty. He talked about what it meant to find your person. He talked about how lucky I was. I thought about that toast a lot during the weeks that followed. The second phone had 23 calls to his number over a 30-day period, most of them between 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon when I was at the office. The texts I found were careful, nothing explicit, nothing that would hold up as smoking gun evidence in isolation. But I had been reading my wife for 17 years. I knew what her words looked like when she was trying to sound casual and failing. Let me know when you're on your way. I'll make sure the garage is open. That wasn't 2 friends coordinating a visit. That was 2 people who had done this enough times to have a system. I closed the phone and drove to work and sat at my desk and opened a set of blueprints I'd been reviewing for a hospital expansion project in Columbus. I stared at the load calculations for 4 hours without changing a single number. The thing nobody tells you about discovering a betrayal is that the silence afterward is the loudest part, not the confrontation. I hadn't had that yet. Just the silence of knowing and choosing, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, not to act immediately. Something in me had shifted gears without asking permission. The part of me that would have demanded answers and begged for explanations had stepped aside, and something quieter and more methodical had walked in to take its place. I told myself I needed more information. That was the rational framing. But the truth was simpler. I needed to understand the full shape of what had been done to me before I decided what to do about it. My son was 20 at the time, a junior at Ohio State studying computer science. He came home on weekends occasionally, and I was grateful that he wasn't there during those first 2 weeks while I was still figuring out what I was looking at. He was perceptive in the way that young people are when they grew up watching their parents closely. He would have known something was wrong immediately. I started small. I kept a notebook, a physical one, cheap and spiral-bound, the kind I used for job site notes, and I began recording things. Times she left the house, duration, stated reason, actual behavior when she returned. Within the first week, a pattern became visible that I was embarrassed not to have noticed before. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, like clockwork. Always an excuse that was just plausible enough. Errands, a client lunch, a yoga class she'd apparently started attending. Never a location she mentioned by name. Always home before dinner, slightly too relaxed, the way people are after they've exhaled a tension that had been building all day. On the second Thursday, I left work early and parked 2 streets over from our house at 12:30. I watched my wife's car pull out of the garage at 12:47. I followed at a distance, which was easier than I expected. She wasn't watching for a tale because she had never, in 17 years, had any reason to think I might do something like this. She drove 20 minutes to a neighborhood I recognized, a subdivision on the east side of Crestwood, where my best friend had bought a house 4 years ago after his divorce. She pulled into the driveway. The garage door opened. She drove inside. The door closed. I sat in my car at the end of the block for a while. The neighborhood was quiet, midday, everyone at work. A FedEx truck came and went. A woman walked a golden retriever. The garage door stayed closed. I drove back to the office and finished reviewing the blueprints. That night, my wife made pasta and we ate together, and she asked about my day and I asked about hers. She mentioned the yoga class, said the instructor had introduced a new sequence she was enjoying, said her hamstrings were finally loosening up. I told her that was great. I poured us both more wine. She laughed at something on television and leaned against my shoulder, and I sat very still and thought about load-bearing capacity, about how much weight a structure could absorb before the stress became visible on the surface. The next morning, I called my brother-in-law, her younger brother, who had never particularly liked her husband choices and had told me so exactly once, diplomatically, at Christmas 3 years ago. I didn't tell him what I suspected. I just asked, in a roundabout way, whether he'd noticed anything different about his sister lately. The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. She seems distracted, he said carefully. I figured it was work stuff. I thanked him and changed the subject. So it wasn't new, whatever this was. It had been going on long enough for people on the periphery to register a change and file it away without knowing what they were filing. I gave myself a week to sit with that. I'm a methodical person by training and by nature. I don't make structural decisions based on incomplete data. I don't recommend a design until I've stress-tested it from multiple angles. So I didn't go to his house and knock on the door. I didn't confront my wife over dinner. I didn't call him and ask what he thought he was doing with 17 years of my life. Instead, I opened a new document on my personal laptop and started building a file. I retrieved 2 months of our shared credit card statements and found charges at restaurants I'd never been to. Always on Tuesday or Thursday, always the same general area of town, always amounts that suggested one person eating, not two, because she was careful enough to pay for their shared meals separately. I found a charge at a luggage store in March that she had never mentioned, and that corresponded with no trip I was aware of. I found a recurring monthly charge to a photo storage app she had never told me she used. I created a second email address and used it to set up a cloud storage account where I uploaded everything I found, not because I was planning to take her to court. Ohio was a no-fault divorce state, and I wasn't naive enough to think evidence of adultery would dramatically change the financial math. I was documenting because I needed to see the whole picture laid out in front of me before I knew what I was going to do with it. 3 weeks in, I knew enough. I called my son on a Sunday night and told him I needed to talk to him about something important and that I needed him to keep an open mind. He drove home the following Friday. We sat at the kitchen table after his mother had gone to bed and I showed him the file. He was quiet for a long time. He stared at the documents, the timeline I'd built, the photographs I had taken from my car. When he finally looked up, his jaw was set in a way I recognized. It was my jaw, the one I'd seen in the mirror every morning of my adult life, the one that meant a decision had been made. How long? He asked. I told him what I knew. What are you going to do? I told him I wasn't sure yet, but that I wanted him to understand the situation fully before anything happened. He was an adult. He deserved to know. He asked if I needed his help. I said I'd let him know. What I did next wasn't something I was proud of, but I wasn't ashamed of it either. It existed in a space beyond pride and shame, in the territory of necessary action. I reached out to a woman I'd heard about through a colleague, someone who specialized in private documentation for divorce proceedings, which in practice meant she was very good at obtaining information that would otherwise be difficult to obtain. I never used her name. She never used mine. I paid cash and we communicated through an encrypted messaging app, and within 10 days, she'd provided me with a confirmation of what I already knew, plus a detail I hadn't known. They had booked a hotel in Chicago for the last weekend in April. 3 weeks away. That weekend happened to be the same weekend my wife had told me she was visiting her college roommate in Pittsburgh. I thought about that for a long time. The hotel reservation was the piece that clarified everything. This wasn't just an affair that had wandered into existence through proximity and weakness. This was a relationship with planning behind it, with infrastructure. Chicago didn't happen by accident. Chicago was a choice, made by two people who had decided they deserved something more than what they were living, and who had calculated that I was too ordinary, too predictable, too invisible to find out. That calculation was the part that got me. Not the betrayal itself, as devastating as it was. Not the Tuesday afternoons. Not the luggage I'd never seen. It was the certainty they had operated with. The confidence that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't figure it out, wouldn't do anything about it even if I did. I was the guy who fixed things. I was the stable one. The reliable one. The one who came home every night and paid the mortgage and never made anything difficult. I was load-bearing infrastructure. Useful. Unexamined. Taken completely for granted. I decided I was done being invisible. The plan came together over 2 weeks. It was simpler than what I'd been imagining. I had briefly entertained more elaborate scenarios, but simplicity was more sustainable and harder to poke holes in afterward. I didn't want anything that could be misrepresented or misunderstood. I wanted something clean, something that would last. The first thing I did was call a real estate attorney, not a divorce attorney, a real estate attorney, specifically because I wanted to understand the exact legal standing of the house we own jointly. My name was on the mortgage. Both names were on the deed. What I learned confirmed what I needed to know about timing. The second thing I did was call a financial advisor I had used professionally and arrange a series of account adjustments that were entirely legal and entirely within my rights as an individual, separate from our joint finances. Nothing that could be contested. Nothing that stepped over a line. Just a careful, deliberate repositioning of the assets that were mine. The third thing I did was talk to my son again. He was better with technology than I was. He was a computer science student, which was convenient, and he understood the concept I laid out for him without needing much explanation. His mother and my best friend believed their communication was private. It wasn't in the way that most people's digital communication isn't particularly private if someone who knows what they're doing decides to look. My son didn't intercept anything precisely. He just helped me understand the shape of what was coming. What was coming was this. They weren't planning to keep things as they were. The Chicago trip was preparation for a larger conversation. His divorce had already been finalized for 2 years. There was a discussion about whether she would ask me for a separation after the holidays, when her biggest work project wrapped up and her bonus cleared. There was a discussion about whether to stay in Crestwood or relocate. There was a discussion, casual and matter-of-fact, about how I would probably be fine. He's resilient, you know how he is, he'll just throw himself into work. And about how my son was old enough that the disruption would be manageable. He'll just throw himself into work. I read that line 3 times. I wrote it in my notebook. I thought about how you could live alongside a person for 17 years and understand them so superficially that you thought their primary response to being gutted was professional dedication. I made 2 decisions that night. The first, I was not going to be the person who found out and did nothing. The second, whatever I did had to be something I could stand behind completely. Nothing illegal. Nothing that put my son in a difficult position. Nothing that I would spend the next decade regretting. I wasn't going to destroy myself to destroy them. I was going to do this carefully, and I was going to do it right. The weekend of the Chicago trip arrived on a cold Friday in late April. My wife kissed me goodbye at the front door with her rolling suitcase and her story about Pittsburgh, and I watched her car back out of the driveway and turn north. North, not east, which is the direction Pittsburgh would have been, and I went inside and made coffee and called my son. He drove down from Columbus that afternoon. While they were in Chicago, we worked. We spent the weekend systematically going through the house, not destroying, not removing anything that was jointly owned, but organizing, documenting, separating. I packed the things that were mine. Clothes, books, the tools in the garage that I had bought over 20 years of weekend projects. Boxes that went into storage. The house began to look subtly different, the way a room looks when you remove a piece of furniture and rearrange around its absence. Not empty, just altered. My son helped without asking many questions. At one point, he stopped in the middle of the living room and looked around at what we'd done and said, "Dad, are you sure about this?" I told him I had been sure since the night I found the second phone. He nodded. We kept working. On Sunday evening, while they were presumably flying home from Chicago, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote 2 emails. The first went to her supervisor. Not an accusation, not anything salacious, just a carefully worded note from an anonymous address raising a specific concern about a conflict of interest in her handling of a client account, something I had noticed in the statements, and that was, in fact, a genuine irregularity. It was the kind of thing that would require an internal review, the kind of thing that would take months to fully resolve, and during which her professional reputation would be held in a particular suspension. The second email went to 6 people: our closest mutual friends, her parents, her brother, and my best friend's sister, who had contacted me once after his divorce to apologize for how he'd handled things with his ex-wife. I had thought it was an odd call at the time. I understood it better now. The email was 3 paragraphs. It contained no accusations, only documentation, the timeline, selected records, the hotel confirmation. It was written in the same tone I used for project reports. Factual, clear, no dramatic language, no appeals for sympathy. I stated that I was sharing this information because these were people who had been close to both of us, and I believed they deserved to know the truth about what our marriage had actually been for some time. I wished everyone well. I thanked them for their friendship over the years. Then I hit send, closed my laptop, and poured my son and me each a glass of the good whiskey I'd been saving for no reason in particular. She came home Monday morning expecting the house she had left Friday afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she came through the door. She was still in her travel clothes, rolling her suitcase behind her, slightly tired in the way you are after a weekend of performing normalcy. She saw me and smiled, and then she looked around the kitchen. At the bare counters, the boxes stacked near the back door, the absence of the photographs that had lived on the refrigerator for years, and the smile stayed on her face for exactly 2 seconds past the point where it made sense. "What's going on?" I told her to sit down. She stood. I told her that was fine and that I would explain either way. I had printed the documentation and arranged it in a manila folder, the same kind I used for project files, and I slid it across the table. She looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. I watched her open it. I watched her face as she moved through the pages. The interesting thing, and I had not predicted this, was that she didn't cry. She went very still, the way a person goes still when they're doing rapid calculations, and she looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 17 years. It wasn't guilt and it wasn't shame. It was something closer to assessment. She was trying to determine how much I knew and what I planned to do with it. "How long have you known?" I told her it didn't matter. Mason said she started, and I corrected her. My name was Daniel. She knew that. She used the wrong name when she was flustered, borrowing someone else's frame. She set the folder down. "We need to talk about this." I agreed. I told her I had already started the conversation with several people who cared about both of us, and that by now they had likely seen the same documentation she was holding. I watched that land. I watched her pick up her phone. I watched her face change as the messages came in. "You had no right." I interrupted her gently. I told her that I had spent 17 years building something with her and that she had spent at least the last year quietly dismantling it. I told her that I was not angry, and that was the truth. I had moved past anger somewhere around week 2 of the notebook. What I had now was clarity, and clarity was a different and more durable thing. I told her that I wasn't going to fight her in court, that I intended to proceed with the divorce as straightforwardly as possible, that I had already spoken to an attorney, and that I expected the process to be simple and civil if she chose to make it that way. I told her that I was moving out by the end of the week, that my son knew everything, and that I hoped someday she would understand what she had actually cost herself. She told me I was being cold. I thought about the word. I decided it wasn't quite accurate. Cold implied indifference. What I was feeling was something more like the specific, clear-eyed calm that comes after a long and complicated calculation has been completed. The variables had been resolved. The structure had been assessed. The load had exceeded capacity, and the failure had been documented. Now there was the business of what came next. "He came here on Tuesdays," I said. Not a question. She didn't answer. I told her I knew. I told her I had always known more than she assumed I did, and that this was possibly the most important thing I hoped she would carry forward. The understanding that being quiet and being oblivious were not the same thing. She asked me if I had told his sister. I told her I had copied several people on the email. She looked at her phone again. I could see from across the table that it was filling with notifications. The morning was unraveling for her in real time, and I was watching it happen with the detached attention of someone observing a controlled demolition, something they had designed that was proceeding exactly as calculated. He arrived 20 minutes later. I hadn't expected that, but I wasn't surprised. His name was all over the email. He would have driven to our house as soon as he saw it, and he would have pushed back to have a conversation rather than face the silence of people who now knew. He knocked. I opened the door. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "Daniel, let's talk." I told him to come in. We stood in the kitchen, the three of us, surrounded by boxes. He looked at my wife first, then at me. He was trying to read what kind of situation this was, whether it was volatile, whether I was going to be irrational. He was running the same assessment she had run. They were both still trying to figure out who I had become. "I know this is hard," he said, "and I know we owe you more than we gave you. But this isn't—" I stopped him. I told him I didn't need an explanation. I told him I had something I wanted him to understand, and that I wanted him to listen without interrupting, and that after I was done, he was free to say whatever he needed to say. He stopped talking. I told him about the toast he gave at our wedding. I had memorized parts of it, as it turns out, the way you memorize things that meant a great deal to you at the time. I recited 2 sentences. I watched his jaw tighten. I told him that I had spent 17 years believing that those words reflected something true about his character, and that I wasn't telling him this to wound him, but because I wanted him to understand the specific nature of the loss. It wasn't just a friendship. It was the version of himself he had described at that table, the person who understood loyalty and meant it. "That's who I thought you were," I said. "I think that's who you thought you were, too." He didn't respond to that. He looked at the floor. I told them both that the divorce attorney would be in touch with her by the end of the week. I told him that I had no interest in any further communication and that I expected the same courtesy from him going forward. I picked up my jacket from the back of a chair and the bag I had packed and staged near the back door the night before. I was moving to a furnished apartment I had leased 2 weeks earlier in a neighborhood on the north side of Crestwood where I didn't know anyone and nobody knew me. My son was driving back to Columbus that afternoon. We had said what needed to be said over the whiskey Sunday night, and neither of us was the type to prolong a goodbye. Before I walked out, I turned back once. I told my wife that I hoped the thing she had built while she was building it with him was worth it. Not sarcastically. I meant it as an actual wish. I had loved her for 17 years with something real, and I was not capable of pretending that had been nothing, but I was also no longer capable of pretending that love by itself was a sufficient foundation for a structure. You needed integrity. You needed honesty. You needed to know the actual weight of the load before you asked someone to carry it indefinitely. She had tears on her face. He was still looking at the floor. I walked out to my car and drove to the apartment. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. Quieter in the way that comes after a long fever breaks. Not peaceful exactly, but clarified. I worked. I ran. I learned to cook 3 or 4 things well, which was more than I had managed in 17 years of someone else handling dinner. My son called every Sunday evening, and we talked about his coursework and his friends, and occasionally about nothing in particular, which I had learned was its own form of generosity. The review at her workplace concluded with findings that resulted in a formal reprimand and the loss of 2 major accounts. Her professional reputation in Crestwood did not fully recover. She relocated to Chicago eventually, which had a particular irony I didn't dwell on. His reputation took a different path. His sister, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this kind of confirmation. She knew her brother's patterns. She had seen the divorce, had heard things she hadn't been sure how to interpret. When the email arrived, she made calls. His social circle, which had always been partly our shared social circle, contracted sharply. He sold the house in the East Side subdivision and moved to a city I didn't know and wouldn't have reason to visit. I received no calls from either of them asking for reconciliation or explanation or absolution. I was grateful for that. I had nothing left to offer in any of those categories, and I preferred the clean line. A year after that Monday in the kitchen, I sat on the back deck of the apartment. I had moved to a townhouse by then, Something with the small yard I was slowly making habitable, and thought about who I had been when this started and who I was now. The two people were continuous in some ways. Same name, same job, same methodical approach to problems, same son who called on Sundays. But the version of me who had stood in the driveway watching my wife drive north when she had told me she was going east, that man had believed, on some foundational level, that the structures he built and inhabited were sound, that they would hold, that the load calculations were accurate. I didn't believe that anymore. I believe something different now, something harder and more useful, that structures failed all the time, that the failure wasn't always visible on the surface until it was already catastrophic, and that the work of a structural engineer was not to assume soundness, but to continuously test for weakness. To look at what appeared solid and ask what it was actually made of, and whether it could bear the weight being asked of it. My son drove up one Saturday in early summer, and we grilled steaks in the yard and talked until it got dark. At one point, he looked at me across the table and said, "You seem different." I asked him different how. He thought about it. Like you know something you didn't used to know. I poured us both the last of the wine. I told him that was probably accurate. He asked if it was worth it. The whole thing, the way it had ended. I told him I didn't think that was the right question. You didn't ask if a structural failure was worth it. The failure was a fact, not a choice. What you asked was whether the assessment you did afterward was accurate, and whether the thing you built next was built better. I told him I intended to build better. He raised his glass. The evening was warm and the yard was starting to look like something. Somewhere down the street, somebody was playing music on a porch. A perfectly normal Saturday in a city where I was just beginning to figure out who I was, what I could carry, and what I was willing to put my name on. Some foundations crack silently for years before anyone notices. The smart engineer doesn't wait for the collapse. He learns to read the wall. I was reading the wall now.